Take your hand off my table, Adrian.
I'm not touching your table.
Then leave my gala.
I was invited.
By whom?
Someone who wants your $2 billion deal to survive.
Still speaking in riddles?
Still signing things you haven't read?
Her smile disappeared.
Before they move, ask Damon one question.
Damon Vale, her chairman, stepped closer.
Don't indulge him.
You always did mistake silence for leverage.
She poured the wine across my navy suit. A brass key on a faded navy and pink cord slipped from my jacket and hit the floor. Closing trustee Ruth Bennett stared at it. "Where did you get that key?" Camille snapped. "Ruth, this has nothing to do with the sale." "It might." Damon pointed toward the doors. "He's a bitter ex-husband trying to wreck your night." I looked at Camille.
Ask him why my consent page was replaced this morning. That's a lie. Then you have nothing to fear. I made one call. Put the closing on integrity hold. Camille whispered, "You can't." My phone buzzed. Already done. Behind her, the signing screen turned red. The deal wasn't gone yet. But midnight had just become a deadline. The big screen behind the stage had been showing the countdown to closing all night, green numbers ticking down toward midnight. Now it flickered and reset itself in blunt red letters. Integrity review pending. 400 people who had come to watch a $2 billion sale get finalized were now watching me instead, wine soaking through my shirt, wondering if the evening had just become something else entirely. Camille turned on me with the microphone still live. "You froze my closing because I threw wine on you?" "No," I said. "The wine just stopped me from being polite about it." Ruth stepped between us before Camille could answer that. She was in her late 60s, small and precise, the kind of woman who had spent 40 years being the only calm person in rooms exactly like this one. "Mr. Cole still holds a founder's stewardship consent," she said, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear, but not loud enough to sound like a show. "It allows him to request one integrity review if he believes the employee ownership terms have been altered. That review is now active." "For how long?" Camille said. "Until midnight. After that, the hold expires whether or not he has produced evidence." Ruth looked at me, not unkindly. "If the evidence doesn't hold up, Mr. Cole risks losing the consent entirely, on grounds of abusive interference." Damon hadn't moved. He was watching me the way a man watches a fire he's confident will burn itself out. Then he turned to the 2 security officers by the ballroom doors and said, without raising his voice, "Escort Mr. Cole out. Then find communications and tell them we have an unstable former founder interfering with his ex-wife's transaction." I understood exactly what he was doing. He wasn't fighting the accusation. He was replacing it. In the next hour, if he had his way, this wouldn't be a story about a possibly forged signature. It would be a story about a bitter, wealthy ex-husband trying to sabotage the biggest night of his ex-wife's career in front of 400 witnesses who had just watched her humiliate him first. Sympathy is not evidence, but it moves faster than either. 2 men in dark suits took my arms, more careful than rough, and walked me toward the side doors. I let them. Fighting it would only prove Damon's story true. As we crossed the edge of the dance floor, I looked down, out of habit, to check my jacket pocket for the key. It wasn't there. I found it 2 seconds later in Damon's hand. He must have lifted it off the floor while everyone was still staring at the wine on my shirt. He held it for exactly as long as it took to be sure I'd seen him do it, then slipped it into his vest pocket and turned back toward Camille as if nothing had happened. I said nothing. There were 400 people watching, a closing screen counting down, and a man walking me toward the exit. This was not the moment to explain why a rusted brass key mattered more than the deal it was standing next to. So I let it go, and I filed the silence away the way I always did, telling myself I would fix it later. I would learn before the night was over that later is not always guaranteed to come in time. The service corridor outside the ballroom still smelled faintly of machine oil, decades after the last turbine had rolled off this floor. Astron Foundry Hall had been a factory once, and the renovation had kept just enough of that history to remind everyone walking through it that something real used to get built here. I stood under one of the old steel beams and pulled out my phone, and that was where Jonah Reed found me. He was younger than I expected for a compliance manager, maybe 35, with the wary posture of someone who had learned the hard way not to trust powerful people who show up asking for favors. I'd met him twice before, both times briefly, both times through lawyers. He didn't know me. He knew about me. "Are you here to save the company?" he asked. "Or punish your ex-wife?" "If I wanted to punish Camille," I said, "I would have stayed home and let her sign." He studied me for a moment, decided that was at least an honest answer, and gestured for me to follow him into a side office that still had the company's original blueprints framed on the wall. Asteron Gridworks had been built by 3 people in this building, back when it was still mostly empty floor space and unpaid invoices. Camille, her father, and me. Her father had died 6 years ago, right in the middle of a credit crisis that nearly took the whole company down with him. Damon had stepped into the chairman's role during that crisis and never fully stepped back out. Camille and I had disagreed, badly, about how to survive it. I had left the company not long after. The marriage ended without either of us ever really explaining to the other why. What remained of my old position was almost nothing. I had signed away nearly all of my economic stake years ago. The one thing I had kept, buried in the original founding documents, was a narrow right that didn't let me run the company, block a sale I simply disliked, or touch a single dollar. It let me ask one question, one time, if a sale looked like it was going to erase the profit-sharing promise the founding team had made to the employees who built this place with us. That question was now open, and the clock on it was midnight. "Show me the consent page," Jonah said. I pulled it up on my phone. My signature sat at the bottom, exactly where it should. At a glance, it looked right. "Line spacing's off," Jonah said, tapping the screen. "And the date. Where were you 2 days ago?" "Denver, in a meeting with 40 witnesses." He didn't say anything for a moment, just pulled his laptop closer and started typing. "Give me a minute." It took him 3. When he turned the screen toward me, his expression had changed. "The consent file was re-uploaded this afternoon," he said. "Whoever did it used an old founder-level credential." "Whose?" He looked at me for a long beat before he answered. "Yours." I didn't say anything right away. I was too busy understanding what he'd just told me. Somewhere in the last 24 hours, someone had used a credential with my name on it to alter a document I hadn't touched. That wasn't proof I'd been wronged. As far as anyone in that ballroom would see it, that was proof I'd done it myself. "Keep going," I said. Jonah pulled the metadata further apart. The original consent file, he confirmed, had existed exactly as I remembered signing it years ago, when the founding terms were first drawn up. The version now attached to tonight's closing packet was different. Not just resigned, but restructured, and the replacement had happened after Camille had already initialed the rest of the closing documents, which meant she had approved a deal believing one set of terms were locked, while someone quietly swapped what those terms actually said. That was the first real reveal of the night. I was right that the file had been altered. I still had no idea who had done it, or how they'd gotten a credential with my name attached to it. Jonah opened the transaction summary next, scrolling until he found an attachment I'd never seen before. Post-closing workforce integration schedule. He turned it toward me. I read it twice to be sure. Camille had been told, and had told her board, that the employee profit-sharing trust, the one her father had insisted on from the very first year, the one I'd fought to protect even after I gave up almost everything else, would be preserved under the new ownership. This schedule said otherwise. Within 90 days of closing, the profit-sharing structure would be folded quietly into general compensation. On paper, it would look like a benefits update. In practice, it would erase the one promise this company had never broken. "They didn't just replace my signature," I said. "They changed what my signature was agreeing to." Jonah didn't get the chance to answer. His screen went dark, then lit up again with a single line of red text. "Account suspended. Board review." His remote access had just been cut from somewhere else in the building in real time. My phone rang 30 seconds later. "Damon, you have less than 3 hours," he said, pleasant as ever. "Spend them carefully." "You knew I'd look." "I knew you'd do what you always do," he said. "Go behind Camille's back and call it protection." He hung up before I could answer, which was fine, because I didn't have one. He wasn't wrong about the shape of it, even if he was wrong about why. I found Camille 20 minutes later on the old machine floor, standing near the display case that still held the company's original tools, the ones her father had insisted on keeping even after everything else got modernized. She wasn't looking for me because she'd decided to trust me. She wanted to know why Ruth Bennett, a woman who had overseen 100 closings without blinking, had gone pale at the sight of one brass key. "You kept it," she said. Not a question exactly. "Yes." "Why?" "Because throwing away a key doesn't change what happened behind the door." She didn't soften at that. If anything, her jaw set harder. "Do you know what it was like?" she said. "Burying my father and finding out 3 weeks later that our biggest lender was threatening to call the loan, while my husband packed a bag and told me he needed space? I became CEO of a company that was about to collapse, alone, because you decided you couldn't handle staying." "I left," I said. I didn't add anything to soften it. Not yet. "That's it? You left?" "I transferred almost everything I owned in this company to you before I went, so the lenders couldn't use our divorce as leverage against the loan.
So no bank could say the founder's marriage was falling apart and use it to pull financing out from under you. She stared at me like I'd started speaking a different language. Damon told me you sold your stake because you didn't believe the company would survive. Damon was wrong, or he lied. I've never been sure which one he prefers.
It would have been easy for that to be the moment everything softened between us. It wasn't. Camille folded her arms. You still made the choice without telling me. Yes. She didn't have anything gentler to offer me than that word landing in the space between us, and I didn't ask her to. The key, she said instead, changing course. Why does it matter to Ruth? I glanced past her toward the ballroom doors, where Damon stood in conversation with two board members, one hand resting casually against his vest, exactly where the key now sat. Ask yourself something, I said. If it's just a sentimental scrap of metal I couldn't let go of, why did he take it? Something shifted in her face, not trust, just the first crack of a question she hadn't asked herself yet. She left to find Damon alone, and I let her go. Because some doubts have to be planted by the person who owns them, not handed over by the person who benefits from them. I heard how it went secondhand, later, from someone standing near enough to catch it. Camille had asked him directly why he'd taken the key. Damon told her it was because I used symbols to manipulate her, that I'd always been better at gestures than honesty. It was a good answer. It was also, according to the person who told me, delivered a half-second too fast, with a little too much certainty for a man who supposedly thought the object was meaningless. Camille didn't come back and tell me she believed me. She wasn't there yet. But she did come back, and she did ask me one more question, quieter than the others. Why didn't you fight Damon for the chairman's seat 6 years ago? You had the standing. You had my father's trust. I told her the part I'd never said out loud. Not to her. Not to anyone. I'd suspected back then that Damon was using the emergency financing crisis to consolidate control over the board, moving pieces while everyone else was grieving. I didn't have proof strong enough to act on. Damon had warned me plainly that if I turned the company into a battlefield right after her father's death, our biggest lender would see instability and walk. So I chose silence. I told myself I was protecting her from a fight that might sink the company entirely. You protected me, Camille said slowly, by deciding what I was allowed to know. That was the mistake. She didn't answer that. She turned and walked back toward the ballroom, and I watched her go without following, because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't sound like an excuse dressed up as an apology. I found her again a few minutes later, near the stage, watching something over Damon's shoulder with a stillness that hadn't been there before. A member of the communications team was reading a draft statement off a tablet, and Damon was nodding along to it. I got close enough to hear the last line before she noticed me. Adrian's allegation has been disproven. The investigation wasn't finished. The hold hadn't been lifted, and Damon was already writing the ending. I watched Camille's eyes move from the tablet to Damon's face, and for the first time all night, I saw her ask herself a question she couldn't answer with the story she'd been told for 6 years. Why is he writing the ending before the evidence is finished? Jonah found me again before I found him. He'd lost his remote access, but not his badge, and a badge was enough to walk down to the print room on the executive legal floor and pull a physical log. He held it out, one finger tapping a line near the bottom. The consent replacement had been printed from that floor, at a time that lined up exactly with the file's alteration. The badge that opened the door belonged to an administrative assistant who worked directly out of Damon's office. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even close to proof beyond doubt. But it was enough for Ruth to extend the hold instead of letting it quietly expire. And Jonah agreed to put his name on the finding, knowing full well what that might cost him if Damon won the night. "He'll fire me either way," Jonah said when I asked if he was sure. "At least this way it's for something." Ruth walked back into the ballroom a few minutes later and took the microphone herself, calm as a woman announcing a delayed flight. "The closing will not proceed until the integrity question is resolved," she said, and stepped back down before anyone could turn it into a debate. I watched Camille's face while Ruth spoke. For the first time since the wine hit my jacket, there was no anger in it, just uncertainty, which from her was close to a miracle. She found me near the archive corridor a minute later. "If the file was changed," she said, quiet enough that only I could hear it, "I'll support a full review, all the way through." For a moment, standing there, it felt like we were winning. I had an anomaly nobody could explain away, an access record tying the printing to Damon's office, a compliance officer willing to stand behind the finding in public, a trustee extending the hold instead of letting it lapse, and an ex-wife who had just said, out loud, that she'd back a real investigation instead of a quiet cover story. I watched Damon's smile disappear across the room, and for the first time all night, I let myself believe midnight might not be the deadline it had felt like an hour ago. That belief lasted exactly as long as it took Damon to walk back onto the stage. He didn't deny the file had changed. That surprised the room more than any denial could have. "The problem," he said, taking the microphone from Ruth's assistant with the ease of a man who had never once doubted he'd get it back, "is not whether the file changed. The problem is, who changed it?" A screen behind him lit up with a system report. The credential used to upload the replacement consent page traced back to an old founder-level audit token. My name sat at the top of it, plain as anything. Then he produced something worse, an email years old that I had sent Camille during a fight neither of us had ever fully recovered from. He read it aloud, slow enough for every syllable to land. "If you ever sell what we built without protecting the people who built it, I will stop you." I remembered writing that. It had been a promise made in grief to a wife I loved about a company her father had built with his hands. In this room, tonight, stripped of every bit of context that made it true, it sounded like a threat from a man who had just tried to sabotage a $2 billion closing using his own hidden credentials. The board's emergency committee didn't take long to decide. Adrian Cole had a possible conflict of interest. The hold would not be extended on the strength of evidence tied to his own audit token. Security escorted Jonah out of the building within the hour, his badge deactivated before he even reached the lobby. Camille found me under the old machine floor lights, and for the first time all night, there was no uncertainty left in her expression at all. "You kept an active audit token after you left the company," she said. "I kept a stewardship credential." "And you never told me." I didn't have anywhere to put that sentence except the truth. And the truth was the same mistake wearing a different suit. I had kept something back again, told myself it was for the company's protection,
and let her find out about it from someone else at the worst possible moment. "You're doing it again," she said, and she didn't wait for an answer before she walked away. Damon returned to the microphone a few minutes later, unhurried. "The closing ceremony will resume," he said, and the applause that followed wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It was enough. I stood alone under the old factory clock that still hung above the machine floor, the one that had never worked in all the years I'd known this building, its hands frozen at some hour from decades ago. Every piece of leverage I'd walked in with tonight was gone. The evidence pointed back at me. My credibility was gone with it. My one ally had just been walked out the door. Camille had pulled every ounce of her support. I had no access to the network, no access to the archive, no access to anything that mattered. I looked toward the corridor that led to the Founder Archive, sealed since before Damon ever set foot in this building, and understood something I should have understood hours earlier. I had spent the whole night trying to beat Damon inside a system he controlled. Every document, every login, every credential, all of it lived on servers he could touch from a laptop. I had been fighting him with his own tools, on his own ground, and losing exactly the way a man loses when he agrees to play a game his opponent designed. That way of winning had just died in front of 400 witnesses. It was time to stop looking for it. I found Jonah in the loading bay outside, waiting on a ride he hadn't called yet, still wearing his suspended badge because nobody had bothered to take it off him physically. "I kept trying to win without telling Camille everything," I said. "Same as 6 years ago, just a different room." He looked at me for a long moment. "Maybe that's why he can keep using what you don't say. You leave him the space to fill it in." He was right, and hearing it out loud from someone who barely knew me made it impossible to keep pretending otherwise. So I made a decision standing in that loading bay before I had a single new piece of evidence to justify it. Whatever happened before midnight, win or lose, I was going to tell Camille the rest of it, all of it, without waiting for the right evidence to make it safe. And once the truth of tonight was settled, one way or the other, I was going to give up the Founder stewardship consent permanently. Not as a bargaining chip, as the cost of having used silence as a weapon for 6 years and calling it protection. That decision didn't get me any closer to proving what Damon had done. For that, I needed something he couldn't touch from a keyboard. Years ago, after a dispute over what had actually been said in a board meeting, I had installed a second recording system in this building, a local unit entirely offline that captured audio inside the boardroom, independent of whatever digital system Damon's people controlled. Damon had spent years migrating everything onto the cloud, consolidating it under his access, confident that whoever controlled the servers controlled the truth. He didn't know the old unit still existed, sealed inside the Founder Archive along with the rest of the company's earliest records. Getting into that archive required 2 keys. Mine was in Damon's vest pocket. The second had belonged to Camille's father, and after he died, it had passed to her. I couldn't get into that archive without her. Not because some rule required it, because the only person who could put that key in my hand was standing 30 feet away, having just told me I was repeating the worst thing I'd ever done to her. I didn't go find her. Not yet. Some things have to come from the other direction, or they don't mean anything. Camille told me later what happened next, and I believe every word of it, because none of it made her look easy to forgive. She walked into Damon's private office under the excuse of needing the revised workforce schedule. His desk was empty except for a folder and, sitting beside it, my key. Damon walked in a moment later and asked what she needed. "The revised schedule," she said. "Does the buyer preserve the employee sharing plan?" "In substance," Damon said. "That wasn't my question." He didn't answer it directly. He handed her a different document instead, one hand covering part of the page, and started talking about timeline logistics. While his attention drifted toward his phone, Camille picked up my key and slid it into her palm. She didn't stop there. On her way out, she detoured past the old display case on the machine floor, the one that still held her father's things behind glass, and used her own access to open it. His key had been sitting there for 6 years, kept as a memorial rather than a tool. She took that too. She hadn't chosen a side yet, not out loud, but she had just done something that would end her career at this company if Damon found out before she was ready to explain it. She found me in the service corridor outside the archive, both keys closed in her fist, and she didn't hand them over right away. "If I give these to you," she said, "and you're wrong, what happens?" "Then I sign away the last control I have," I said, "and you never have to wonder again whether I came back for your company or for you." "And if you're right?" "Then you decide what kind of company is left." She opened her hand. The archive door hadn't been touched in years. 2 locks sat side by side, cut for 2 keys turning at once, an old-fashioned safeguard from a company that had never fully trusted any single person with everything. Camille and I stood in front of it, and for a moment, neither of us said anything at all. There was no music here, no crowd, no reason to make this feel like the reunion it wasn't. Just 2 people about to find out whether one of them had told the truth. We turned both keys together. The seal broke with a sound like a held breath finally letting go. Inside, the archive held exactly what I remembered leaving there. Early founding documents, ledgers older than the company's first computer system, and against the back wall, a small metal unit with a single blinking light, still drawing power from a line Damon had never thought to cut because he didn't know it existed. I found the morning's recording without much trouble. I didn't play the whole thing. I didn't need to hear every word to know we had something real. Just enough to confirm it. Damon's voice, giving an instruction about the consent page, though the recording cut before the full reason came through. I stopped the playback. "Why did you stop it?" Camille asked. "Because if we use this," I said, "Ruth has to verify it before anyone can claim we edited it ourselves. If I stand up there and play you a private recording I found alone in a locked room, it proves nothing except that I know how to find locked rooms." Somewhere above us, a security panel chirped. The archive's motion sensor had triggered an alert the moment the seal broke, and it hadn't taken Damon long to hear about it. He didn't come to the archive. He didn't need to. He went straight to the board. Camille had granted him emergency closing authority months earlier, back when the deal was still fragile, and she'd wanted a fail-safe in case she was ever unreachable during the final negotiations. It had been her decision, made in good faith, to keep the transaction from collapsing over a bad phone connection. Damon was about to use that same authority as a weapon. If the acting CEO could be declared conflicted, unable to act, he could chair the closing committee himself and push the transaction through in her place. By the time we made it back toward the main hall,
The gala had already been turned into something else. Damon stood on the stage, addressing what remained of the crowd, no longer smiling, no longer performing calm. "A private marital dispute," he said, "has been weaponized tonight against 400 families and a $2 billion transaction that this company badly needs." It was a dangerous sentence, and an effective one. It turned every employee in that room, every family whose future depended on this deal closing cleanly, into a shield standing between me and the truth. If I walked up there with nothing but a recording and an accusation, I wasn't going to look like a man protecting them. I was going to look like a man willing to burn their future down to win an old argument with his ex-wife. I carried the sealed recorder toward the stage anyway, because there wasn't another way through this that didn't run straight through the middle of it. Damon had the microphone, the board, the security detail, the lawyers, and the official closing clock still ticking down behind him. He invited me up to speak with the easy confidence of a man who believed I was about to finish the job of destroying myself that he'd started an hour earlier. I didn't start with the recording. "Damon is right about one thing," I said, and I watched the room go still around that sentence. I kept things from Camille. Across the stage, I saw her go rigid, bracing for whatever came next. I kept an old audit credential active without telling her. I investigated Damon's role in this company without telling her. Years ago, I left our marriage still believing that silence was a form of protection. I let that sit for a second before I finished it. I decided what Camille could handle knowing. I called it protection because that sounded better than admitting it was control. Nobody in that room had expected a confession, Damon least of all, and it took him a moment too long to recover his footing. "Thank you," he said finally, reaching for the microphone stand like it was a lifeline. "That is exactly why no one here should trust a word this man says." "They shouldn't have to," I said. I set the sealed recorder on the podium in front of Ruth. "They only have to trust what happened." Ruth examined it the way she examined everything, without hurry and without theater. She checked the archive seal, confirmed the unit's serial number against the founding record she kept on file, and read the tamper indicator built into the casing. "This device has not been opened or altered since the archive was sealed," she said into the microphone to the whole room. She didn't say Damon was guilty. She didn't have the authority to say that, and she knew it. She said only what she could verify, and let that be enough. Damon turned to Camille next, and I understood immediately what he was about to ask her to do. "Tell them," he said, "that Adrian accessed that archive without authorization." It would have been the easiest lie of her life. It would have saved the deal, saved her position, and cost her nothing that anyone in that room could see. She looked at the 400 faces still watching her, and she said, "He didn't." "Camille!" I gave him the second key. The murmur that moved through the hall wasn't outrage. It was something closer to disbelief. The sound of a room realizing the story it had been told all night had just come apart in front of it. Camille didn't stop there. "And what I believed about Adrian," she said, "did not give me the right to pour wine on him in front of everyone he used to know." She wasn't asking anyone to forgive her for it. She was simply saying it out loud, in the one room where it had happened, because that was the only place it could be said honestly. Damon didn't fold. That was the mistake every version of this story gets wrong. Men like him rarely fold at the first blow.
or even the second. He activated the emergency authority Camille had granted him months earlier, declared her conflicted and unfit to continue overseeing the closing, and informed the room that he would be chairing the committee for the remainder of the transaction himself. The deal, as far as he was concerned, was still very much alive. Ruth didn't argue his authority to do that. She only asked one question. "Before this committee proceeds, will you allow the recording to be heard in full?" He didn't have a way to refuse that in front of 400 witnesses without looking exactly like what he was. Ruth played the relevant portion. It wasn't long. It didn't need to be. Use Cole's old token. Replace the consent page. The employee schedule changes after closing. By the time anyone compares versions, the transaction will already be done. Nobody in that room needed a lawyer to explain what they'd just heard. Damon tried anyway. He said the recording was taken out of context, that the employee terms could still be renegotiated in good faith, that I was exploiting a minor technical irregularity to reclaim control I'd spent 6 years pretending I didn't want. That accusation was the opening I needed, and I used it the only way that would actually settle the matter. I laid the founder stewardship document on the podium in front of Ruth. "I'm using the stewardship consent one final time," I said. Damon almost smiled. "There it is, the control you never wanted to surrender." "No," I said. "This is the part where I surrender it." I signed the relinquishment in front of Ruth, in front of the board, in front of Camille, in front of everyone Damon had tried to turn against me an hour earlier. It was irrevocable, effective the moment the current transaction was formally terminated. It didn't need a long explanation. Everyone in that room understood exactly what it meant. I was using the last piece of power I had to protect a promise her father had made to the people who built this company. And then I was giving that power up for good. So Camille would never again have to wonder whether I'd come back to reclaim something instead of to tell the truth. The buyer's representative didn't need long to reach the only decision available to him. He closed the binder in front of him and stood. "We cannot close a transaction supported by an altered consent and undisclosed terms," he said. "Our offer is withdrawn." The screen behind the stage changed one final time. Transaction terminated. $2 billion disappeared from that closing. Not because I was wealthy enough to outlast anyone in the room, and not out of some final act of revenge against a man who deserved one. It disappeared because of everything that came before it. A suspicion, a choice to keep investigating instead of walking away, a failure that cost me almost everything I'd walked in with, a new method that didn't depend on a system Damon controlled, evidence with a source he couldn't touch, a sacrifice I made before I knew it would matter, and a trustee willing to verify only what she could actually verify. Damon had believed 3 things all night, and he was wrong about every one of them. He believed the digital systems he controlled were the only truth that mattered. He believed Camille would always choose the deal over the truth, given the choice. And he believed I would always keep power rather than give it away. The board removed him from the closing chair before the room had even finished clearing, pending a full review. Nobody called the police. Nobody needed to. Some men lose everything that matters to them just by watching the story they built for themselves
collapse in front of the people who used to believe it. By the time most of the guests had gone, Foundry Hall had gone quiet in the way old industrial buildings do, the silence settling into the steel beams overhead like it belonged there. My jacket still carried the faint stain from earlier in the night. I hadn't changed it. There hadn't been a reason to. Camille found me near the old Founder workbench, the one her father used to stand at while he explained blueprints to two people too young to know how hard the next 6 years would be. She held out the brass key. I took it, looked at the cord, navy and pink, braided by her own hands the first year this company existed, and worked her father's key loose from it. I set it on the workbench in front of her. "That one was always yours," I said. "You kept the cord," she said. I kept a lot of things I should have talked about instead. Neither of us reached for anything easier than the truth of where we stood. "I don't know what happens to us," she said. "Neither do I." "Can we talk?" she asked. "When this is over?" I looked around the empty hall, the closing screen finally dark, the clock above the machine floor still frozen at whatever hour it had stopped keeping years ago. "Yes," I said. But this time, no protecting each other with silence. The deal was gone. The employee sharing structure her father had insisted on stood exactly where it always had, while the board opened an independent review into everything Damon had built around himself in 6 years of unchecked control. Camille still had her own accounting to do, with her board, about the wine, about how much unquestioned authority she'd handed to one man because it was easier than watching every decision herself. Nobody wrote her out of that as a victim who owed nothing. I had my own accounting too, further along than hers, since I'd already signed mine away in front of 400 witnesses. Camille picked the brass key back up off the workbench and turned it once in her hand, watching the light catch the old, worn metal. It had never really been a symbol of who owned this place. It had only ever needed 2 people willing to turn it together and tell each other the truth about what was on the other side of the door. 3 weeks passed before either of us tried to keep that promise. The independent review into Damon's 6 years as chairman finished faster than anyone expected, mostly because he stopped fighting it halfway through. Once the board saw the full pattern behind the consent page, not just one bad night, but a history of decisions quietly routed around anyone who might have asked a harder question, there wasn't much left for him to defend. He resigned from every remaining position rather than be removed from them. Nobody threw him a farewell dinner. Nobody expected one. Jonah got his badge back within the week, along with back pay and a formal apology he told me he didn't especially want. Because an apology doesn't undo the 2 nights he'd spent wondering if he'd just ended his own career for a stranger's fight. What he did want, and got, was a permanent seat on the committee overseeing the employee sharing trust, with language in the charter now that made it a great deal harder for any future chairman to fold it quietly into something else. Ruth helped draft that part herself. She told me once, without much ceremony, that verifying a seal was the easy half of her job, and that the harder half was making sure nobody ever needed her to do it again. Camille called me on a Thursday, not to talk about any of that, but to ask if I still drank coffee the way I used to, black and too strong. I told her I did. She said there was a diner 2 blocks from the old foundry that had survived every renovation the building had gone through, and that she'd be there at 9 if I wanted to find out whether either of us remembered how to have an ordinary conversation. We weren't good at it that first time. We circled around easier subjects for the better part of an hour before either of us mentioned the gala at all. When we finally did, it wasn't the wine or the closing or Damon. It was the key. "I keep it in my desk now," she said. "Not the display case. My desk." "Why the change?" "Because a case is for things you're finished with," she said. "I'm not finished with it." I understood that better than she probably realized. I still had the cord, navy and pink, worn soft at the braid where her hands had shaped it a lifetime ago, in a building that used to make turbines instead of memories. I hadn't decided yet what to do with it. Some things don't need deciding right away. Some things just need to be kept honestly, out where you can see them, instead of hidden away and explained later, if at all. We didn't leave that diner promising each other anything permanent. We left it agreeing to come back the following Thursday, and the one after that, and to keep telling each other the parts we used to leave out, the small ones as much as the large ones, because I'd learned the hard way that it's rarely the big secret that breaks something. It's the years of small ones stacked up quietly that a person mistakes for peace. The foundry still stands. The turbines are long gone, but the beams overhead are the same ones her father once stood under with two people too young to know what they were building, or what it might someday cost them to protect it honestly. Have you ever learned too late that silence can hurt as much as a lie? Tell me in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe for more stories about dignity, consequences, and the choices that reveal who we really are.